So going into our presentation, I have the pleasure of welcoming and introducing Annalise Johnson-Smith, who's a school psychologist. She lives in Pittsford with her spouse and 2 children. She has worked as a school psychologist for 11 years in a number of public and private schools throughout the west side of Rochester. And she has done this presentation multiple times for her staff. So we were grateful and glad that she was able to do that for us as well. So I do want to thank everybody for joining. And without further ado, I'm going to transfer it over to Annalise because my 4-year-old is getting loud.
Thanks for having me. It's good to see you all. So welcome to the Power of Pronouns and Names on Identity, Acceptance, and Inclusion. I'm going to be sharing a lot of information with you. There's a lot of ground to cover. I know I speak fast sometimes, but I think it's important that we have a quick intro at the beginning. So I'm going to exit screen share in a minute, and we're going to go around and just say our names, share our pronouns if you choose to. And then if you had a question or reason you signed up that you wanted to share, you could also add that. After that, we're going to go into some terminology and definitions, a little LGBTQ 101, because there's lots of terminology, some history, current recommended practice, share some resources, and have time for Q&A at the end. So I know that sometimes the order, feel free to add questions into the chat and shout out if anything comes up. So a few ground rules: maintain confidentiality, listen actively, be aware of your body language, avoid generalizations, but speak to your own unique experiences, be curious, not furious, judgment-free, and get comfortable being uncomfortable. So I'm going to share a poll. Do you go by any name other than your legal first name is the first question. And the second question is, do you know anyone that has changed the pronouns that they use? That one's multiple choice. So you can select how many people. Give it a couple more seconds. Sometimes technology doesn't always work. Okay. All right. So hopefully you can see the results. I'm going to hit the share results button. It's been a while since I've done this with the polls. Usually my co-facilitator handles that. So we have 2 people who sometimes go by a different name. And then as far as knowing people that have changed the pronouns that they use, a bunch of people know 1 or 2 people. That's great. Thank you all. So why are we doing this? This is evolution. There's increased awareness of, gender diversity, and a responsiveness to include all people is always our goal. There's also state and federal anti-discrimination laws that guide what we do. The DASA Act, as well as there's a guidance doc from New York State Education Department. So included is gender identity and gender expression as far as protected categories go. And really the best learning environment is where people feel safe, where they feel belong and accepted for who they are. So that's the real reason that we're doing this, is, it's inclusion. So I'm going to do a short video. This video was 5 years ago. So it was a little while ago, but I think it really portrays, a good case of a family that's in this situation.
Transgender people to use the bathroom of their choice in city facilities. Similar laws are being debated around the country as the transgender movement pushes for greater protection. And while the transgender community is finding a growing voice in popular culture, its members are still widely misunderstood. A new book, Raising Ryland, chronicles one family's journey parenting a transgender child who's already facing a major hurdle. John Blackstone shows us how the family hopes its story will raise awareness.
Not long after her first birthday, Ryland Whittington's parents, Jeff and Hillary, learned their child was profoundly deaf. It wasn't until doctors put in cochlear implants that Ryland was able to hear for the first time.
You hear that?
For a while there, we didn't know Ryland would be able to talk or hear or just communicate.
Ryland did learn to speak, but what she had to say didn't make sense to her family.
This is my sister, Billy, and I know brother,
Ryland started saying, "I'm a boy." And at the time, we just thought it was cute. It was a phase. I thought maybe I would have a tomboy.
It was around 3 that we started to hear it, but around 4 years old was when it got very strong.
Jeff and Hillary struggled to understand, Jeff especially. You were trying to avoid it?
I was avoiding for a while. I knew that Ryland was going to have a difficult life with the cochlear implants, or at least that's what my perception was. So to add something on top of that, I just couldn't accept it. I couldn't picture it.
I'm sure what a lot of people can't believe about your story is that at 3 years old, a little girl can say, "I'm a little boy."
We could have ignored it and we could have pushed it away and said, "No, you're a girl," and fought it.
Well, we did.
And we did.
For the first part.
But
It became so persistent.
They say Ryland demonstrated the key markers that doctors and psychologists look for in determining if a child is transgender. At the time, like so many people, Jeff and Hillary didn't get what it meant to be transgender. Now they do.
Watch the ball.
This is 8-year-old Ryland today.
Over the fence.
After much research, counseling, and soul searching, Jeff and Hillary say they came to the inescapable conclusion that Ryland's gender identity did not match the sex on her birth certificate. So at age 5, Ryland began living as a boy. When you see pictures of yourself when you were 3 and 4 years old, does that seem strange now?
kind of. A little weird.
Seems a little weird?
Yeah.
Ryland remembers how he refused to wear clothes made for girls.
It was a little way of showing my mom and dad that I was a boy.
What makes you so strong, so determined?
I just had a weird feeling that I wanted to be a boy.
From the time you were very young?
Yeah.
This is just as likely to be hardwired as sexual orientation. It's not a choice.
Dr. Stephen Rosenthal is researching the long-term outcomes of medical treatment for transgender youth in a study funded by the National Institutes of Health.
There is no reason to believe that transgender people haven't been around since people have been around, just like any other variation in human biology.
Rosenthal says treatment is crucial because an alarming 41% of transgender people attempt suicide. But new research in the journal Pediatrics found that children who have socially transitioned to the gender with which they identify had normal levels of depression and anxiety.
We have seen so many kids who have come into our practice, like Ryland, who have fully socially transitioned, and family after family tells us that as soon as they enable their kid to do this, everything turned around.
When you were researching and seeing that attempted suicide rate, 41%,
41%.
what was that?
Awful.
It was horrible.
Awful.
You know, would we rather have a living son or a dead daughter? And, you know, we weren't willing to play with that statistic. We'd rather have a living son.
What are you guys doing? We're making a cake.
I'm not kidding when I say that the child changed overnight. It was just, he was so proud all of a sudden and just so happy and just felt so comfortable. And you could just see him ease up.
There's people who blame you, say you did this to him.
It would never be something that I would push on my child. In certain ways, it is and will make Ryland's life a little bit harder. And I don't want my child's life to be any harder.
There are decisions ahead, including whether to eventually give Ryland male hormones. It's a little while before puberty sets in now, but you've got to be thinking about that.
You know, thankfully there's puberty blockers, which
allow us to delay the onset of puberty for a period of time.
I think it is really important to note that we haven't done anything that isn't reversible.
Jeff and Hillary are sharing their story because they want Ryland to live in a world that accepts him.
Hey, Dada.
What?
Know how you made that tunnel?
Hopefully we just plant the seed of little conversations all over the world. People can just start understanding this more.
And there's so many more people who are willing to go public with it and who are coming out and trying to help this world to understand. So I think we'll get there. We'll get there.
For CBS This Morning, John Blackstone, San Diego.
They seem like a very nice family.
They don't deserve blame, they deserve applause. Jeff and Hillary, just the fact that we're having the conversation is so important.
I agree.
What do you think, Charlie?
I think it's very important, and I think people need to know they're not alone.
Me too, me too.
So this is a visual of what we're going to be talking about. This is the genderbread person. You can see that there's 4 distinct areas: identity, orientation, sex, and expression. So I'm going to go over those terms now, as it's easy to get them all confused. First is assigned sex. Typically when someone's born, they're assigned a sex based on the appearance of their external anatomy. However, approximately 1 in 2,000 people do not have external anatomy that is clearly visibly male or female, and those people would be considered intersex. When you think of more than just the external anatomy, when you think of post-secondary sex characteristics, hormones, genetics, and other factors, it's estimated that approximately 1 in 200 people could be considered intersex. That is approximately as common as having red hair. So raise your hand if you know somebody with red hair. So intersex is more common than we know. Gender identity is separate from our assigned sex. This is a person's deeply internal held sense of who they are, their gender. So that's up here. Transgender is an umbrella term for people whose gender identity does not match the sex they were assigned at birth. So this is how you identify yourself, your gender identity. You might be cisgender. I am. The identity I was assigned at the sex I was assigned at birth aligns with my gender identity. However, many people are transgender. A recent poll showed, I think it was Generation Z, 1.8% of Generation Z reported they were transgender in a poll. I don't know the sample size or anything, but there's an increasing amount of people who are affirming transgender as their identity. Gender identity terms to be aware of: male, female, trans, non-binary. Non-binary is an umbrella term. So we have kind of one way of thinking is male, female, binary, 2 options, right? But people are sharing that that does not align with who they are, that gender can be a spectrum. It can be a landscape. That gender is more broad than just 2 options. So non-binary could be people who just fall outside of just the one either or option. Some people who are non-binary identify as both male and female. Some identify as an entirely separate gender or neither. So it's just a term to be aware of. There's other terms. Gender fluid is one of them. And there's many more. So our gender identity starts to develop in toddlerhood, as you saw with Ryland in that video. So it starts very young and it can continue into adulthood. Exploration is something that's ongoing. A book I'm reading right now, the author is 30, and right now they say they're a boy, but they're still kind of thinking about it. So it's something that really can develop over time and change over time as we explore. We expect that people explore their identity, and the more terms that are out there, the more people find that really relate to them and something that they can really call as their own. So separate for gender identity is sexual orientation. That's who you're attracted to. It could be physically, sexually, socially, emotionally. Some terms that you may have heard: heterosexual. Homosexual, you'll see is crossed out. Homosexual is a term that's falling out of favor, although some people may still use that term for themselves. It's not a term that is currently encouraged to be used, so that's why it's crossed out. You might use gay or lesbian instead of that. Asexual is another term, bisexual, queer, pansexual. And our sexual orientation starts a little later, pre-adolescence, all the way through adulthood. And it's expected that people will explore, and folks' identity can change over time. People express their gender identity can change from day to day. Some people who are gender fluid might say that, and from year to year as well. So in our society, this is a broad generalization, but in our society, people tend to assume that someone is straight and that someone is cisgender. that tends to be an assumption. And again, I'm overgeneralizing here, but those are assumptions we made, which is why the coming out process exists, because people are coming out and sharing that they don't fall into those assumptions. This process here it doesn't have to be linear, but in the beginning it's private, it's personal, and people may share in public. They might share with someone they don't even know very well because it feels a little less vulnerable rather than sharing with someone that they do know and love. And it could be years going through this internal process before someone shares externally. The coming out process is also something that not only does an individual experience, but it's something that family and friends are also going through. So there's an adjustment period for anyone who's close to someone, whether you're school staff or friends or family. Something to be aware of is that, what you see and what exists for that person are two very different things. Continuing on with gender, there's the umbrella of transgender you see on your left, and I've explained that it's not considered binary, although some people still believe that it is, but a growing portion of people report that they're gender queer, demi boy, demi girl, gender fluid, bigender, agender, neutral, and many, many more things. So I don't expect you to know all those terms, but just be aware that there's a growing list. Maverick is one that I read about recently. So there's a growing list of terms that feel right to people. When you look at the pie chart on your right, you'll see this is data compiled by the Human Rights Campaign in 2018 of LGBTQ youth. And you'll see the pink and blue portion are those binary trans boy, trans girl folks. And you see that's less than half of the pie chart. So there's a really large amount of people who are saying that they are either gender non-conforming, non-binary, or using another term that's kind of outside of that binary model. So it's important to be aware that this is also becoming more common. Gender expression is the fourth category. This is how we present ourselves to the world. And gender expression has a lot of stereotypes that go with it. About 100 years ago, pink used to be considered a masculine and strong color. Now, when people are saying they're having a boy, what colors are they going to be buying?
Blue and green.
Thank you. And if you're not going to find out the sex of the baby, might be what's yellow. The most common. Yep. Yellow. Thank you. So on this slide, you see a lot of like visual gender expression ideas that we have that we tend to associate with masculinity or femininity. But there's also gender stereotypes about behavior, about what toys children should play with, and lots of other things. The genderbread person. So again, it's 4 different areas. You see the hearts are overlapping. Gender identity is up here. It's in our head. A person could identify as female, male, both, or another gender entirely. Gender expression is that outside dotted line. It's how we present ourselves to the world. It could be feminine, masculine, or androgynous, or other. Sex you're assigned at birth is represented through that little DNA symbol, and it could be male, female, other, intersex. And then the hearts are what we're physically and emotionally attracted to. So I threw a lot of information at you, and I don't expect you to remember it all. The key takeaway is that terminology is going to change over time. Like the word queer, that used to be a kind of a derogatory term, and now youth are reclaiming it, and they love that word, both for sexual orientation and for gender identity. So the terms are going to change over time, but we can just never go wrong with asking a person how they wish to be addressed and just using their terms. So this is the trick. This is your take-home message, is the shortcut of mirroring. So whatever term an individual gives you, whatever name they give you, whatever pronouns, whatever identity term, that's the word you use. So it's a great thing to know, and you just take other people's lead. The other take home is, regardless of what sex someone is assigned at birth, if they have the gender identity of a boy, they are a boy. If a person has a gender identity of a girl, they are a girl. So there's a history with trans exclusionary feminism and people not being left out of different movements and being included. And so if someone says, I'm a girl, you don't want to say, well, actually, because you know, they were maybe assigned male at birth. You wouldn't say, actually, you're a trans girl. You don't want to belittle someone's identity. You want to affirm their identity. So just mirror whatever terms they use. So how would you like to be referred to? How can I refer to you? This applies to staff as well. And in school settings, we typically use Mr., Miss, Mrs., Ms. And the term that people use that's considered ungendered is mix. See that checked off there? So mix is actually now a choice in a dress-up game that my kids play on Roblox. So like these games are evolving and moving with children and the young people as they speak up and advocate for themselves. Mix is now an option in addition to Miss and Mr. in this game my kids play. So it's really becoming a lot more common and more well-known. So keep your eye out for mix, and we don't want to assume what someone wants to be called. We just want to know by asking them. So I'm going to do a short video on implicit bias, because when we talk about stereotypes, we have to consider bias as well. I have to hit stop share for a second because I'm having a hard time finding it. Sorry about that. Here we go. It's just a quick 1-minute video that I think illustrates the idea pretty easily.
Our brain is hardwired to trust what's familiar and be suspicious of what's unfamiliar. It's a basic survival instinct that's helped keep us safe for thousands of years.
We unconsciously sort things into familiar versus unfamiliar, same versus different, them versus us. Here's a test. How do you feel about people who own a handgun?
Don't attend church. Vote for the other candidate.
Are on welfare. Don't eat meat. Have tattoos.
Don't believe in marriage.
Drive an electric car.
Didn't go to college.
Don't speak English. Curse.
Are over 60.
Are disabled. Drive the speed limit.
Love cats.
Love dogs. Can you feel your brain sorting people into groups? Was there a little them versus us happening? It can happen unconsciously.
Okay, so I liked how that video just showed a lot of different ideas and categories, and kind of gives you a little emotional response. I don't know if anyone else had a little emotional response when they said certain things, but this is just something our brain does. They call it hidden bias, implicit bias. Our brain makes connections, and those connections are just a part of life. But when it comes to gender identity, we make those connections very quickly, and those assumptions can harm people. So it's something to be aware of, that we all have some biases when it comes to gender. When we first did this presentation, we asked people to share their biases, and that wasn't very, very popular. So I'm just sharing my own. So this is a picture of a book that I read, Beyond the Gender Binary. And when I looked at this cover of this book, I immediately went to a judgment on this person. I thought, that's a man, a gay man in a dress. So I thought about their sexual orientation. I made a judgment there, and their gender identity, just based on looking at them. So it happens very quickly, and it's just something to be aware of, that we all do it, and we want to pause and try not to, make assumptions about people. Okay, so additional terminology to know. The first one is intersectionality. This term was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in the 1980s, relating to Black women being left out of the feminist movement. So the idea is that we're talking about gender today, and that's really good and it's important, but humans can't be explained by one single category like gender, race, or sexual orientation. The intersection of all these categories can produce experiences that are both resulting in privilege or oppression. So intersectionality is just the idea of looking at the individual and their whole self and all of their identities and their life experiences, and not just focusing on one thing. The average life expectancy of a Black trans woman is 35 years old. This is a result of an intersection of a lot of different layers of oppression, right? Transphobia, sexism, racism. Another statistic that's on here, 1 in 3 LGBTQ youth are identified as people of color, and queer youth of color have higher rates of homelessness, harassment, and suspension. So, racism and sexism and homophobia, all these things can interplay and work together and work against individuals and make their experiences more challenging. So that's something to be aware of when you're working with students and individuals. Neurodiversity is the second term. There's been some research studies on people with autism and their gender identity, and people with autism are 3 to 6 times more likely to report that the gender they were assigned at birth is not the identity that they affirm. So it's a correlation. People with autism are just more likely to report being transgender or not, having the sex they were assigned at birth, not identifying that way. So, as far as intersectionality, think about disabilities as well. Chosen name is another term to be aware of. This is a name selected by an individual that is not their legal name, but it could become their legal name. The example I gave is, imagine you have a child, it's a girl, and you name her Rose. It's a beautiful name. But as Rose grows up, Rose identifies as a boy and has he, him, his pronouns. And the name Rose does not feel right. There's memories of dressing up and, it's not right for them. So they pick a new name. They pick the name John, and that is their chosen name. It can also be called preferred name or affirmed name. We put also known as on forms where I work. So it's just important to know that when a person tells you this is their name, we go with it. If someone says, my name is Rain, Rain it is. Dead name is the opposite. That's the name that someone has, their legal name is no longer used. So in the case of Rose, you would not call them Rose anymore. You would only call them John. And although, it's expected to make mistakes, over time, you would also, when you're talking about that person in the past, want to talk about John, even though it was Rose back then, saying the name John. Some people don't mind having their dead name used, but some people find it really upsetting and really offensive. So just the general guideline is don't use the dead name for a person. Use their chosen name, their affirmed name, because that's who they are, and it can really hurt when you don't. So why do we ask pronouns? That's what we do. That's what we recommend doing. That's considered best practice. It shows respect for all individuals. Some people are fearful of initiating, and safety is a concern, and so is fear of rejection. And it also avoids microaggressions. Misgendering is very common for individuals whose gender expression does not match and align with their gender identity perfectly. So if you see someone, you see they have long hair, you say, hey girl, come here, and that person's not a girl, you're misgendering them. Microaggressions have been described as like 1,000 tiny paper cuts, right? One time it might hurt a little, but if it happens over and over again, multiple times a day, it can really hurt. So if you know someone's pronouns, that are they, them, theirs, then you're not using she, her, hers, and you're not misgendering them inadvertently if you don't even know their identity. So we ask pronouns because it's expressing inclusion and acceptance for all people and having that sense of belonging. And again, it's the ideal condition for learning, working, living, and being. So pronouns, she, her, hers, he, him, his, are often considered gendered, although some people, an author of the book I read identifies as a boy and uses she, her, hers pronouns. So even that doesn't always line up perfectly. Again, it's an individual choice. It's your gender, it's your pronouns, you choose, and they are not an option for others. The term preferred pronouns used to be used, but now we just call them pronouns because if someone says these are their pronouns, this is what we use. They, them, theirs is becoming increasingly common. I know some people have reported that they, them, theirs are plural, so it doesn't sound right, it doesn't feel right saying that. They, them, theirs was actually added to the dictionary. It's still considered plural, but it was also added to the dictionary as a singular pronoun as well. So it's language is evolving, and they, them, theirs is okay to use. If you think about it You likely already have used they, them, theirs when talking about a person. Imagine you walk into a cafe and you see a mitten on a table and you say, oh no, someone lost their mitten. They must have a really cold hand. I better go find them. So there you go. I just said they, them, theirs in 3 different sentences talking about a person whose identity I didn't know. So they, them, theirs is kind of what you would recommend defaulting to if you didn't know a person's identity, because that's the ungendered pronouns, and that way you're not misgendering someone. There are hundreds of other pronouns, z, here, zier, many others. I was in a Zoom call a couple weeks ago, and 3 of the 10 people that were there did not have she, hers. One of them had she and they. People sometimes do identify more than one pronouns feel right to them, and that's okay. If someone shares 2, you can use either one, but typically people just pick one, but just be aware that it could be multiple. Also, this is a learning process for us all. I love that lots of you shared that you get corrected a lot, and that's expected. It's actually kind of a compliment if you get corrected a lot, because those people are really comfortable around you. And it takes practice to learn the pronouns that are right for a person when you have been using different ones for years and you're used to using she, her, hers, he, him, his. So it takes practice, and it's okay to mess up and know that you are not alone. And it's also really important for these people to affirm their identity. And when a child has someone who uses the right pronouns for them for the first time, it can feel really, really good. So it's worth all the hard work. So sentence starters. If you're not sure of what pronouns to use, just ask. What pronouns do you use? Other things you could say is, I want to be supportive. I'm uncertain of what words to use. I'm still learning. Please let me know if I make a mistake. So typically you wouldn't do this in front of a large classroom. You would do this like in a, when you're meeting someone private, one-on-one kind of a thing. So we're going to do a second poll now. I want to know, how comfortable are you sharing your pronouns? Some of you did it today in our introductions. So go ahead and fill that out. And the second question is, how comfortable are you with asking others their pronouns? Asking others. And asking others. Good to know. And it's new for some of us, and that's okay too. There are a couple of quotes from the National Educational Association. We only have a couple of educators, handful of educators here today. I'm not going to go too much into the detail, but for those who are in education, you might be used to seeing a tiered approach. Tier 1 is considered like a universal intervention, what we're going to be using for everyone. And so there's some universal support strategies that are recommended for school settings, and really workplace settings also align with this as well. And there's a lot of great resources out there for LGBTQ plus inclusive workplace. So you want to honor individual by using their affirmed name and pronouns. Sharing your own pronouns is recommended. You see, I have mine in my Zoom handle. I've added mine to my email signature. And some people have buttons or pins or put it on their work badge. It's optional to share your pronouns, but it's encouraged to do that because you're setting an example and you're showing people that you are open to them sharing theirs if they want to as well. Teachers seek this information out in different ways. It might be online through a form. It might be through a little name tag or a sign-in sheet in the class. You want to make sure it's private. You don't want to put a person in a position where they're going to be outing themselves. However, once someone does share that with you, you want to have that changed on wherever it is in the classroom. If it's like, a birthday board, you want to change that birthday board to have their affirmed name up there and make sure other staff knows. More support strategies. You want to stop bad behavior when you see it and avoid grouping students by gender. Be aware of current terminology, but also know that it's going to change, and that's okay. And be mindful of that binary language. I'm having a hard time with hey guys still. That's a hard one. But there's lots of, I'm going to give you examples on another slide of ungendering our language. It's another way to support all students because we don't know. And honestly, a lot of times we don't need to know people's identity when we're talking to a group of people. You want to support gender expansive youth and also have representation, whether it be in a math problem where you intentionally use they pronouns when you're talking about a person, or this person has two dads or whatever, to whatever materials available in a library. Having representation really makes a difference for students. So those in the mental health profession, you might have like a counseling piece in your job where you are going to talk with a student about where they want this information shared. We want schools to be a safe place for students. However, if it's on documentation and home is not a safe place, then that might be a problem for the individual. So you really want to have a conversation about possible outcomes and where do you want this? Are we just going to be verbally calling you Rain from now on, or is this going to be changed on all your paperwork? So that's, and for anyone who's in special education, we're using this hybrid model right now. If medical field still wants the legal name for billing purposes. So like for IEP goals, we put student will do this, even though it seems impersonal. At least we're not dead naming them at the end of the document. And then at the beginning of the document, we might say Rose goes by John, uses pronouns he, him, his, and will be referred to as such throughout the document. Okay, so gender inclusive or ungendered language. Instead of saying boys or girls, children, kids, if you have a mascot for your school, you could say, hey, midnights, or hey, nights, or, hey, you cats and kittens. You can get creative and get funny, although sometimes it might be a little embarrassing. If you're my child, I showed them a sheet of all the options, and some of them they thought were pretty embarrassing. So, follow the student's lead as far as your child's lead as far as what they're comfortable with. But there's a lot of terms that you can use. And if you use ungendered language as your default, then you're not putting kids who are non-binary in a position where they're uncomfortable. If you're not saying, hey, boys go to the side of the room and girls go to the side of the room, you're not having someone in the middle of the room feeling uncomfortable and not knowing what to do. So general pronoun etiquette, the way a person looks doesn't always indicate what pronouns they use. So it's okay to normalize asking for pronouns. Share yours as well. Hi, I'm Annalise, she, her, hers. How can I refer to you? What would you like to be called? Or that way they can give the space to share and also to pass, because they don't have to. And if they don't share, you can avoid using pronouns. You can use just their name, or you can use they, them. And you also want to just be sure who you can share what with. Okay, so tripping gracefully, this is important. We are all going to mess up sometimes and be corrected. Like I said earlier, it can be a compliment. A kid I know, their gym teacher was misgendering them every gym class, day after day, and it was really weighing on them. And they eventually worked up the courage to tell their gym teacher and correct them. And he did exactly what's on here. He apologized, he corrected himself, and he moved on. And it was the highlight of this kid's day that he just said sorry. And when an adult says sorry, that's kind of powerful. And didn't make a big deal out of it, because you don't want to have someone feeling like they're in the spotlight more than they have to be, because when they're correcting you, they feel in the spotlight, especially in adolescence, right? Developmentally, they can feel like they're on a stage and everyone's watching. So keep it low key, apologize and move on. If you feel really bad, instead of apologizing 18 times, intentionally use the right pronouns next time, and the next time, and speak to them a couple more sentences and use the right ones. So correct it without making it a big deal. So I'm ending with a quote here. We forgive ourselves for our first thought. We all make assumptions, and this is going to be like an ongoing learning process, but the magic happens in our second thought and our first action. That's where our power lies. I have a lot of resources here for you. The Savvy Ally is something that the school district is partnering with. I think they said they bought 100 Savvy Ally books and are going to be doing some book studies. So she has some great resources she used to work through the Out Alliance on for families, for people in the different fields on her website. I put the link for parents and schools on here. So there's just a lot of great resources out there, and you don't have to read a whole book. You can just read a 2-page summary of what you need to do for your given field. And there's a lot of great information out there. A few books that if you're looking to read, a lot of people have different preferences. These are 4 that I can personally recommend. I know Own Voices Are Important. Beyond the Gender Binary is an own voice book that you saw the cover of. It's also super quick. This Is How It Always Is written by a parent of a transgender child. It's fiction, but based on their experiences to an extent. It Feels Good to Be Yourself is for the younger kids, and it just explains what is non-binary and basic gender terms. And The Savvy Ally is a great, easy but thorough read on how to be more LGBTQ inclusive. So that's the end of my presentation. We have questions, comments. It's time for Q&A.